3 days later, Sarah found herself aboard the Alliance frigate Determination, heading toward the outer edge of the Kepler system. Commander Morrison had surprised everyone by approving a modified version of her plan, though only as a small-scale test. If it failed, they would fall back to evacuation procedures. If it succeeded, well, no one really expected it to succeed. The ship's bridge was cramped, designed for a crew of experienced officers who had worked together for years. Sarah sat at a secondary tactical station, surrounded by beings who still viewed her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Captain Thox commanded the mission, his massive form somehow fitting into the captain's chair despite being built for much smaller species. Sensors detect Dominion scout ships entering the system, reported Lieutenant Vera, a Helix officer whose forearms moved across her controls with liquid grace. 3 vessels moving in standard reconnaissance formation. Right on schedule, Sarah said quietly, checking her own displays. She had studied Dominion tactics for months, learning their patterns, understanding how they thought. They were predictable in their efficiency, which would normally be a strength. Today, she hoped to make it a weakness. The scout ships moved through space like predators, their dark hulls absorbing light and giving them an ominous appearance. Each ship was twice the size of the Determination, armed with weapons that could tear through most Alliance vessels with ease. Their sensors swept the system methodically, cataloging planets, moons, and defensive positions. "They're scanning for our fleet," Captain Thox observed. "When they don't find it, they'll call for the main force." "That's what we want," Sarah said, her fingers dancing over her console. "Let them see exactly what we want them to see." She had spent the last 3 days working with the ship's engineers, modifying sensor systems and communication arrays in ways that most officers considered wasteful. Instead of hiding their presence, they were amplifying it. The single frigate was broadcasting energy signatures that made it appear to be a much larger force. The Dominion scouts detected them immediately, just as planned. Sarah watched their movement patterns change, becoming more aggressive as they moved to investigate. She had studied hundreds of hours of battle footage, learning how enemy commanders responded to different situations. These scouts would probe their defenses, test their weapons, and then retreat to report their findings. "First scout is approaching weapons range," Vera announced. "Hold position," Sarah said, then caught herself. She wasn't in command here. "I mean, Captain, I recommend we hold position." Thox's jaw split in what might have been amusement. "Your plan, little strategist. We follow your lead." The first scout ship opened fire with precise measured shots. They weren't trying to destroy the Determination, merely testing its capabilities. Sarah watched the energy patterns, analyzing the weapon signatures and power outputs. Every piece of data was valuable, telling her something about Dominion technology and tactics. "Return fire," she suggested. "But keep our shots wide. Let them think we're outclassed." The frigate's weapons responded with deliberately poor accuracy, missing the scout ship by margins that suggested panic rather than skill. The Dominion vessel moved closer, growing bolder as it appeared to face an inferior opponent. "Second scout moving to flanking position," Vera reported. "Perfect," Sarah said, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction that surprised the bridge crew. "Captain, please begin the maneuver we discussed." The Determination began what appeared to be a desperate retreat, moving deeper into the asteroid field that dominated this part of the system. The Dominion scouts followed eagerly, sensing an easy victory. Their formation was textbook perfect, designed to prevent escape while maximizing firepower. What they didn't realize was that Sarah had spent 2 years studying asteroid mining operations, learning how explosives and gravity could be used to move massive chunks of rock. The field they were entering had been prepared, though the modifications were so subtle that even Alliance sensors couldn't detect them. "Mark 1, Sarah said quietly. Captain Thox activated the first sequence. Hidden charges, placed days earlier by stealth drones, detonated throughout the asteroid field. But instead of creating explosions, they shifted the orbital patterns of hundreds of rocks, turning the entire field into a 3-dimensional maze that changed by the second. The Dominion scouts found themselves flying through space that no longer followed the patterns their computers had mapped. Asteroids that should have been kilometers away suddenly loomed in front of them. Navigation systems, confused by the constantly shifting gravitational fields, began providing contradictory information. "Mark 2, Sarah said. The second sequence activated gravity mines, devices that briefly amplified the gravitational pull of specific asteroids. The effect was invisible but devastating. Scout ships that had been flying in perfect formation suddenly found themselves pulled off course, their hulls scraping against rocks they couldn't see coming. The third scout ship, bringing up the rear, tried to retreat. Its captain had realized that something was terribly wrong, that this wasn't the kind of engagement they had been trained for. But Sarah had anticipated this response too. "Mark III," she said. The final sequence turned the retreat into a trap. The path the scout ship tried to follow led it directly into the largest concentration of modified asteroids. Gravity mines activated in sequence, creating a cascade effect that pulled dozens of massive rocks together like a closing fist. When the asteroid field finally settled, 2 of the scout ships were trapped, their hulls damaged and their systems offline. The third had managed to escape, but its crew would be reporting something they had never encountered before. An enemy that fought with the environment itself as a weapon. "Well," Captain Thox said slowly, staring at the tactical display. "That was unexpected." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "This is just the beginning, Captain. Wait until you see what we can do with a real fleet." The bridge crew was silent, processing what they had witnessed. The Dominion scouts had been some of the most feared vessels in their fleet, commanded by officers who had never known defeat. In less than an hour, 2 had been neutralized without the Determination firing a single effective shot. "The surviving scout is transmitting to the main fleet," Vera reported. "Should we jam their communications?" "No," Sarah said. "Let them report exactly what happened. The more confused their commanders become, the better our chances." Over the next few hours, Sarah coordinated the recovery of intelligence from the trapped scout ships. The Alliance had rarely captured Dominion vessels intact, and the data they recovered was invaluable. But more important than the intelligence was the psychological impact. News of the engagement spread through the Alliance fleet within hours. A rookie human officer had done something that seasoned commanders had thought impossible. She had made Dominion forces look confused, uncertain, almost afraid. "The main fleet is responding faster than expected," Vera announced as her sensors detected massive energy signatures approaching the system. 47 ships, including 3 dreadnoughts. Sarah nodded calmly, though her heart was racing. This was the real test. The scout engagement had been a skirmish, a proof of concept. What came next would determine whether her strategies could work. Against a full Dominion assault force. "Signal the Alliance fleet," she told Captain Thox. "Tell them it's time for phase 2. As the Determination moved to its next position, Sarah stared out at the stars. Somewhere out there, the architect was learning about what had happened to their scouts. For the first time in this war, a Dominion force had been outmaneuvered by tactics they didn't understand. The enemy was about to discover that humans thought about warfare in ways that no other species had ever considered. And Sarah Chen, the rookie nobody took seriously, was just getting started. 3 days later, Sarah found herself aboard the Alliance frigate Determination, heading toward the outer edge of the Kepler system. Commander Morrison had surprised everyone by approving a modified version of her plan, though only as a small-scale test. If it failed, they would fall back to evacuation procedures. If it succeeded, well, no one really expected it to succeed. The ship's bridge was cramped, designed for a crew of experienced officers who had worked together for years. Sarah sat at a secondary tactical station, surrounded by beings who still viewed her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Captain Thox commanded the mission, his massive form somehow fitting into the captain's chair, despite being built for much smaller species. "Sensors detect Dominion scout ships entering the system," reported Lieutenant Vera, a Helix officer whose forearms moved across her controls with liquid grace. 3 vessels moving in standard reconnaissance formation. "Right on schedule," Sarah said quietly, checking her own displays. She had studied Dominion tactics for months, learning their patterns, understanding how they thought. They were predictable in their efficiency, which would normally be a strength. Today, she hoped to make it a weakness. The scout ships moved through space like predators, their dark hulls absorbing light and giving them an ominous appearance. Each ship was twice the size of the Determination, armed with weapons that could tear through most Alliance vessels with ease. Their sensors swept the system methodically, cataloging planets, moons, and defensive positions. "They're scanning for our fleet," Captain Thox observed. "When they don't find it, they'll call for the main force." "That's what we want," Sarah said, her fingers dancing over her console. Let them see exactly what we want them to see. She had spent the last 3 days working with the ship's engineers, modifying sensor systems and communication arrays in ways that most officers considered wasteful. Instead of hiding their presence, they were amplifying it. The single frigate was broadcasting energy signatures that made it appear to be a much larger force. The Dominion scouts detected them immediately, just as planned. Sarah watched their movement patterns change, becoming more aggressive as they moved to investigate. She had studied hundreds of hours of battle footage, learning how enemy commanders responded to different situations. These scouts would probe their defenses, test their weapons, and then retreat to report their findings. First scout is approaching weapons range, Vera announced. Hold position, Sarah said, then caught herself. She wasn't in command here. I mean, Captain, I recommend we hold position. Thox's jaw split in what might have been amusement. Your plan, little strategist. We follow your lead. The first scout ship opened fire with precise measured shots. They weren't trying to destroy the determination, merely testing its capabilities. Sarah watched the energy patterns, analyzing the weapon signatures and power outputs. Every piece of data was valuable, telling her something about Dominion technology and tactics. Return fire, she suggested, but keep our shots wide. Let them think we're outclassed. The frigate's weapons responded with deliberately poor accuracy, missing the scout ship by margins that suggested panic rather than skill. The Dominion vessel moved closer, growing bolder as it appeared to face an inferior opponent. Second scout moving to flanking position, Vera reported. Perfect, Sarah said, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction that surprised the bridge crew. Captain, please begin the maneuver we discussed. The determination began what appeared to be a desperate retreat, moving deeper into the asteroid field that dominated this part of the system. The Dominion scouts followed eagerly, sensing an easy victory. Their formation was textbook perfect, designed to prevent escape while maximizing firepower. What they didn't realize was that Sarah had spent 2 years studying asteroid mining operations, learning how explosives and gravity could be used to move massive chunks of rock. The field they were entering had been prepared, though the modifications were so subtle that even Alliance sensors couldn't detect them. Mark 1, Sarah said quietly. Captain Thox activated the first sequence, hidden charges, placed days earlier by stealth drones detonated throughout the asteroid field. But instead of creating explosions, they shifted the orbital patterns of hundreds of rocks, turning the entire field into a 3-dimensional maze that changed by the second. The Dominion scouts found themselves flying through space that no longer followed the patterns their computers had mapped. Asteroids that should have been kilometers away suddenly loomed in front of them. Navigation systems, confused by the constantly shifting gravitational fields, began providing contradictory information. Mark 2, Sarah said. The second sequence activated gravity mines, devices that briefly amplified the gravitational pull of specific asteroids. The effect was invisible but devastating. Scout ships that had been flying in perfect formation suddenly found themselves pulled off course, their hulls scraping against rocks they couldn't see coming. The third scout ship, bringing up the rear, tried to retreat. Its captain had realized that something was terribly wrong, that this wasn't the kind of engagement they had been trained for. But Sarah had anticipated this response too. Mark 3, she said. The final sequence turned the retreat into a trap. The path the scout ship tried to follow led it directly into the largest concentration of modified asteroids. Gravity mines activated in sequence, creating a cascade effect that pulled dozens of massive rocks together like a closing fist. When the asteroid field finally settled, 2 of the scout ships were trapped, their hulls damaged and their systems offline. The third had managed to escape, but its crew would be reporting something they had never encountered before, an enemy that fought with the environment itself as a weapon. Well, Captain Thox said slowly, staring at the tactical display. That was unexpected. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. This is just the beginning, Captain. Wait until you see what we can do with a real fleet. The bridge crew was silent, processing what they had witnessed. The Dominion scouts had been some of the most feared vessels in their fleet, commanded by officers who had never known defeat. In less than an hour, 2 had been neutralized without the determination firing a single effective shot. The surviving scout is transmitting to the main fleet, Vera reported. Should we jam their communications? No, Sarah said. Let them report exactly what happened. The more confused their commanders become, the better our chances. Over the next few hours, Sarah coordinated the recovery of intelligence from the trapped scout ships. The Alliance had rarely captured Dominion vessels intact, and the data they recovered was invaluable. But more important than the intelligence was the psychological impact. News of the engagement spread through the Alliance fleet within hours. A rookie human officer had done something that seasoned commanders had thought impossible. She had made Dominion forces look confused, uncertain, almost afraid. The main fleet is responding faster than expected, Vera announced as her sensors detected massive energy signatures approaching the system. 47 ships, including 3 dreadnoughts. Sarah nodded calmly, though her heart was racing. This was the real test. The scout engagement had been a skirmish, a proof of concept. What came next would determine whether her strategies could work. Against a full Dominion assault force, signal. The Alliance fleet, she told Captain Thox. Tell them it's time for Phase 2. As the determination moved to its next position, Sarah stared out at the stars. Somewhere out there, the architect was learning about what had happened to their scouts. For the first time in this war, a Dominion force had been outmaneuvered by tactics they didn't understand. The enemy was about to discover that humans thought about warfare in ways that no other species had ever considered. And Sarah Chen, the rookie nobody took seriously, was just getting started. The Alliance fleet arrived at Kepler Station to find something unprecedented. Victory. Word of Sarah's asteroid field triumph had spread through military channels like wildfire. But seeing the captured Dominion scout ships with their own eyes changed everything. Officers who had dismissed her as an overeager rookie now studied her tactical reports with the intensity of scholars examining ancient texts. Sarah stood in the main briefing hall, addressing a room filled with 3 times as many commanders as before. Representatives from 6 different species had requested permission to attend, and for the first time since the war began, there was something other than desperation in their eyes. There was hope. The key, Sarah explained, gesturing to the holographic display, is understanding that the Dominion thinks in straight lines. They see problems and apply overwhelming force in the most direct way possible. But space isn't a straight line. It's 3-dimensional, dynamic, and full of opportunities they ignore. Admiral Kess, the Helix fleet commander, leaned forward with all 4 arms crossed. Your methods are effective, Lieutenant, but can they be scaled up? What we need is something that works against their main battle groups. Sarah had been preparing for this question for days. The asteroid field engagement had been a proof of concept, but the real test would come when they faced a full Dominion assault. I've been analyzing their fleet movements across 12 different systems, she said, calling up a new display. They have patterns, routines they follow regardless of local conditions. The hologram showed ship movements over time, tracking Dominion fleets as they moved from system to system. To most observers, it looked like chaos. Dozens of ships moving in seemingly random patterns, but Sarah had learned to see the underlying structure, the mathematical precision that guided every decision. Look here, she said, highlighting specific movements. They always position their dreadnoughts in triangular formations. Always. It doesn't matter if they're attacking a space station or a planetary defense grid. The formation never changes. Commander Morrison nodded slowly. Predictable formations are vulnerable formations. Exactly. And it gets better. Watch how they respond to threats. Sarah ran a simulation showing how Dominion fleets reacted when attacked. They prioritize target elimination over tactical flexibility. If we present them with multiple threats simultaneously, they'll try to destroy them one by one instead of repositioning for advantage. The room buzzed with quiet conversation as the implications sank in. These were experienced military officers, many of whom had fought the Dominion for years. They understood the significance of what Sarah was showing them. Captain Thox, whose massive frame dominated one side of the room, spoke up. This is valuable intelligence, but intelligence alone doesn't win battles. What do you propose we do with it? Sarah smiled, and there was something in her expression that made several officers shift uncomfortably. It was the smile of someone who had found their opponent's weakness and intended to exploit it completely. We give them exactly what they expect, she said. A traditional fleet engagement with overwhelming odds in their favor. And then we show them why humans are the most dangerous species in the galaxy. Over the next hour, Sarah outlined a battle plan that was both brilliant and terrifying in its complexity. It required precise timing, flawless coordination, and a level of risk that made veteran commanders nervous. Most importantly, it required every ship in the Alliance fleet to work together in ways they had never attempted before. The plan had 3 phases. First, they would lure the Dominion fleet into a traditional engagement near Kepler's largest gas giant. The enemy would see exactly what they expected: Allied ships arranged in defensive formations, trying to protect the system's most valuable targets. Second, they would execute a fighting retreat that appeared desperate, but was actually carefully choreographed. Each withdrawal would draw the Dominion ships deeper into a gravity well that Sarah had studied for weeks, learning every current and eddy in the planet's complex magnetic field. Third, and most dangerously, they would turn the gas giant's own atmosphere into a weapon. The storm systems in Kepler-7's upper atmosphere rotate at different speeds, Sarah explained, showing detailed meteorological data that most military officers had never seen before. By introducing charged particles at specific points, we can create electromagnetic cascades that will disrupt Dominion shielding systems. The room fell silent as the implications became clear. They would be fighting inside a planetary atmosphere, using weather as a weapon against an enemy that had never encountered such tactics. "It's insane," Admiral Kess said finally. "Yes," Sarah agreed. "It is. It's also brilliant," Commander Morrison added. "When do we begin?" The next 3 days were spent in frantic preparation. Sarah worked with engineering teams from a dozen different species, explaining modifications that seemed impossible until they saw the underlying mathematics. She coordinated with pilots who had never flown in atmospheric conditions, teaching them techniques that human pilots had developed during Earth's atmospheric conflicts. Most importantly, she worked with the fleet's intelligence division, refining their understanding of Dominion psychology. The enemy wasn't just technologically superior. They were mentally inflexible. They had conquered so many systems that they had forgotten how to adapt to unexpected challenges. On the 4th day, long-range sensors detected the approaching Dominion fleet. 47 ships, just as intelligence had predicted, including 3 massive dreadnoughts that could each destroy a small moon. The fleet moved in perfect formation, following approach patterns that Sarah had studied and memorized. "Signal all ships," Sarah said from her position on the command bridge. Admiral Kess had officially placed her in charge of tactical operations, a decision that had shocked the entire fleet. Begin Phase 1. The Alliance fleet moved into position around Kepler-7, their ships arranged in what appeared to be a desperate defensive formation. To Dominion sensors, it would look like a classic last stand, outgunned defenders trying to protect a valuable target with inadequate resources. As the enemy fleet approached, Sarah watched their formation with satisfaction. 3 dreadnoughts in a perfect triangle, surrounded by support vessels in mathematical precision. The architect, wherever they were, had once again chosen predictability over flexibility. "They're moving exactly as projected," reported the sensor officer, a young Mentari whose telepathic abilities helped coordinate fleet communications. "Dreadnoughts maintaining formation, escort ships in standard protective positions." "Good," Sarah said. "Let them get closer. I want them to think this is going to be easy." The first shots were fired when the Dominion fleet reached optimal range. Massive energy beams lanced through space, striking Alliance shields with devastating force. 2 frigates were destroyed immediately, their crews dying before they could even respond. "Return fire," Sarah ordered. "Make it look desperate." The Alliance fleet responded with scattered, uncoordinated attacks that seemed to confirm Dominion expectations. Their shots went wide, their formations wavered, and several ships began what appeared to be panicked retreats toward the gas giant. The Dominion fleet pressed their advantage, moving deeper into the system in pursuit of what they believed were fleeing enemies. Their formation remained perfect, their confidence absolute. They had no idea they were flying directly into the most sophisticated trap in galactic military history. "Phase 1 complete," Sarah announced. "Begin retreat to Phase 2 positions." As the Alliance fleet withdrew toward Kepler-7, the Dominion pursued eagerly. They were so focused on their apparent victory that they failed to notice the subtle changes in the space around them. Gravity readings that were slightly off, electromagnetic fields that didn't match their stellar cartography, Small details that would have warned a more cautious commander. Sarah watched the tactical display with growing excitement. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The enemy was strong, experienced, and confident in their superiority. They were about to learn that confidence could be a fatal weakness. The gas giant Kepler-7 loomed before them like a swirling wall of orange and brown clouds, its massive gravity well pulling everything toward its turbulent atmosphere. Sarah stood on the bridge of the Alliance flagship Defiance, watching the Dominion fleet pursue them into the planet's upper atmospheric layers. The enemy ships moved with perfect confidence, their formations unchanged, despite entering an environment unlike any they had encountered before. Atmospheric pressure increasing, reported the navigation officer. All ships maintaining structural integrity, but we're approaching the theoretical limits for most of our hull designs. Sarah nodded calmly, though her heart was racing. This was the moment everything depended on. Months of preparation, weeks of calculation, and years of studying Dominion tactics had led to this single moment. If her plan failed, the Alliance fleet would be destroyed in minutes. Signal from Dominion lead ship, the communications officer announced. They're demanding our surrender. Standard procedure, Sarah observed. They always offer surrender terms before the final assault. It makes them feel civilized. She turned to Admiral Kess. Request permission to respond. The Helix Admiral gestured with two of her arms, indicating agreement. Your battle, Lieutenant. Your response. Sarah activated the fleet-wide communication system, knowing that her words would be broadcast to every ship in both fleets. When she spoke, her voice carried across space to reach thousands of ears from dozens of different species. Dominion forces, she said clearly. You are trespassing in Alliance space. Withdraw immediately or face the consequences. The silence that followed was broken by what could only be described as laughter coming from the Dominion fleet. The idea that a small Alliance force would threaten them while fleeing into a gas giant was apparently amusing to their commanders. The response came from the lead dreadnought, its voice artificially amplified to demonstrate superiority. Small ships, you fly toward your own destruction. Our weapons will find you wherever you hide. Surrender now and your deaths will be swift. Counteroffer, Sarah replied, and there was something in her tone that made every officer on the bridge turn to look at her. You can surrender to us. I promise your deaths will be quicker than you deserve. This time the Dominion response was immediate and violent. Energy beams lanced through the thickening atmosphere, seeking Alliance targets with deadly precision. But something was wrong. The beams scattered unpredictably, their focus disrupted by electromagnetic fields that shouldn't have existed. Phase 2 initiated, Sarah announced. All ships, begin atmospheric insertion. The Alliance fleet dove deeper into Kepler-7's atmosphere, their ships disappearing into cloud layers that stretched for thousands of kilometers. The Dominion fleet followed, their sensors struggling to maintain locks on targets that kept vanishing and reappearing in the swirling mists. What the enemy couldn't see was the network of atmospheric processors that Alliance engineers had installed over the previous weeks. Hidden in the clouds, these devices had been slowly modifying the chemical composition of specific atmospheric layers, creating conditions that would interfere with Dominion technology. Electromagnetic cascade beginning, reported the science officer. Charged particle density increasing exponentially. Sarah watched her tactical display as the trap unfolded. The Dominion ships were flying through atmospheric layers that had been turned into a three-dimensional maze of electromagnetic interference. Their shields, designed to repel energy weapons in the vacuum of space, began fluctuating wildly as they tried to compensate for conditions they had never encountered. First dreadnought losing shield cohesion, the sensor operator announced with excitement. Their defensive systems are overloading. The Dominion formation, perfect for space combat, became a liability in the dense atmosphere. Ships that maintained precise distances in vacuum found themselves too close together when wind currents and pressure changes affected their flight paths. Their targeting systems, calibrated for the predictable physics of space, couldn't adapt to an environment where gravity, pressure, and electromagnetic fields changed every few seconds. Begin Phase 3, Sarah ordered. All ships attack pattern Delta 7. The Alliance fleet emerged from the clouds like ghosts materializing from fog. Their ships, modified with atmospheric flight capabilities that humans had developed centuries earlier, moved through the dense air with an agility that shocked the Dominion commanders. They struck from angles that should have been impossible, using wind currents and pressure differentials to achieve speeds and maneuvers that defied conventional tactics. The first dreadnought tried to maintain its position in the standard triangular formation, but the atmospheric pressure was affecting its maneuvering thrusters. When Alliance fighters came screaming out of a storm front at impossible angles, the massive ship couldn't rotate fast enough to bring its main weapons to bear. Torpedo strikes, guided by atmospheric currents that Sarah had mapped weeks in advance, found weak points in hull plating that had been weakened by pressure stress. The dreadnought's mighty shields, flickering and unstable in the electromagnetic chaos, failed to stop weapons that approached from directions no spaceborne enemy had ever used. "Impossible," came a transmission from the Dominion flagship. "Your ships cannot fly in these conditions." Sarah activated her personal communication channel, speaking directly to the enemy commander. "You're right. Your ships can't fly in these conditions. Ours were built for this." The second dreadnought attempted to climb out of the atmosphere, recognizing that the battle conditions favored their opponents. But Sarah had anticipated this response too. Alliance ships were waiting in the upper atmospheric layers, using the planet's own rotation to achieve orbital velocities that turned them into kinetic weapons. The collision was visible from orbit, a brilliant flash as Alliance fighters deliberately rammed into the dreadnought's engines at precisely calculated angles. The massive ship, deprived of thrust and caught in Kepler-7's gravity well, began an uncontrolled descent toward the planet's core. "2 dreadnoughts down," Admiral Kess announced, her voice filled with amazement. "The third is trying to signal retreat." Sarah studied the tactical display, watching the surviving Dominion ships struggle to regroup in conditions that made their superior technology useless. Their formation had collapsed, their coordination was failing, and their commander was finally beginning to understand that they were facing an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. "Signal the surviving ships," Sarah said. "Offer them the same terms they offered us." The communication went out on all frequencies, reaching every Dominion vessel still capable of receiving transmissions. Sarah's voice, calm and professional, delivered an ultimatum that would have been unthinkable just hours before. "Dominion forces, you are outmatched and trapped in an environment where your advantages mean nothing. Surrender immediately and you will be treated according to galactic conventions. Continue fighting and you will discover why humans are considered the most dangerous species in known space." The response came not from the Dominion commander, but from multiple ships simultaneously. One by one, Dominion vessels began powering down their weapons and broadcasting surrender codes. Not because they had been defeated by superior force, but because they had encountered something that their tactical computers couldn't analyze, an enemy that thought about warfare in completely alien ways. The third dreadnought held out the longest, its commander apparently unable to accept that a force less than half their size had destroyed most of his fleet, using nothing but environmental manipulation and unconventional tactics. When it finally surrendered, the silence from the Dominion fleet was deafening. "Battle concluded," Sarah announced. "Begin prisoner recovery operations." As Alliance ships moved to secure the surrendered vessels, Sarah stared out at the swirling clouds of Kepler-7. Somewhere in the galaxy, the architect was receiving reports of this engagement. The mysterious leader of the Dominion forces was learning that their seemingly unstoppable war machine had been stopped by a species they had barely considered worth noticing. The rookie nobody took seriously had just handed the Dominion their first major defeat of the war, and this was only the beginning. Admiral Kess approached her station, all 4 arms spread in a gesture of respect that Sarah had never seen a Helix officer offer to any human before. "Lieutenant Chen," the Admiral said formally, "I believe we need to discuss your promotion." 3 weeks after the Battle of Kepler-7, Commander Sarah Chen stood in the intelligence briefing room aboard the Alliance command station, studying reports that would have seemed impossible just a month earlier. The Dominion war machine, which had rolled across the galaxy with unstoppable momentum for 2 years, had suddenly ground to a halt. 15 systems, Admiral Kess was saying, her forearms gesturing at the holographic star map. 15 systems where Dominion forces have simply stopped advancing. They're not retreating, but they're not attacking either. The map showed a clear pattern that sent chills down Sarah's spine. Every halted Dominion fleet was positioned in defensive formations around systems with unusual gravitational or electromagnetic properties. Gas giants, asteroid belts, binary star systems. regions where conventional space tactics would be complicated by environmental factors. They're learning, Sarah said quietly. General Thox, recently promoted to Strategic Command, turned his massive head toward her. Explain. Sarah manipulated the display, highlighting the Dominion positions. Look at the pattern. They're no longer entering systems where we could use environmental tactics against them. They're forcing us to come to them in open space where their superior firepower gives them every advantage. Commander Morrison, now serving as her intelligence liaison, nodded grimly. Our intercepted communications confirm it. They're calling you the Environment Witch in their tactical reports. They've created specific protocols for dealing with your strategies. The title would have been amusing under other circumstances, but Sarah found no humor in it. The Dominion's rapid adaptation meant that the psychological advantage of surprise was gone. Worse, it suggested that the architect had taken a personal interest in studying her methods. There's more, Morrison continued, calling up a new set of data. Intelligence has detected increased communication traffic between Dominion command centers. They're sharing tactical information faster than we've ever recorded. Someone is coordinating a comprehensive response to your strategies. Sarah studied the communication patterns, her training helping her recognize the underlying structure. The Dominion had always been highly organized, but this was different. The speed and efficiency of information sharing suggested that someone was giving this situation their complete attention. The architect, she said. We think so, Morrison agreed. And there's something else. 3 days ago, our deep space monitoring stations detected a massive energy signature moving toward Alliance space. It's unlike anything we've seen before. The new display showed sensor readings from the edge of known space. A single contact was approaching, but its energy output was larger than entire Dominion fleets. Whatever was coming, it was something the enemy had never deployed before. Estimated time to Alliance space? Sarah asked. 72 hours, Admiral Kess replied. And based on its trajectory, it's heading straight for the Kepler system. Sarah felt a chill of recognition. The architect was coming for her personally, bringing something powerful enough to ensure that environmental tactics would be irrelevant. This wasn't just a military response. It was a statement that the Dominion's mysterious leader intended to end the threat she represented. We need to evacuate Kepler Station, General Thox rumbled. No, Sarah said firmly. That's exactly what they expect. The architect has studied our tactics, but they're still thinking like the Dominion. They believe overwhelming force is the answer to every problem. And what if they're right? Admiral Kess asked. What if some threats require overwhelming force to stop? Sarah turned to face the assembled officers, and they saw something in her eyes that they had never seen before. Not confidence or determination, but something deeper. An understanding of warfare that went beyond tactics and strategies to touch the fundamental nature of conflict itself. Then they've forgotten the most important lesson in military history, she said. The biggest, strongest army doesn't always win. Sometimes it just makes a bigger target. Over the next 3 days, Sarah worked with a desperation she had never felt before. The architect was bringing something unprecedented to bear against her, and conventional responses would not be enough. She needed to think beyond everything she had done before, to find a solution that would surprise an enemy who had been studying her every move. The answer came from the most unlikely source, the captured Dominion prisoners from the Soyuz and Kepler 7 battle. Their neural interfaces, Dr. Yates, the Alliance's leading xenopsychologist, explained during an emergency briefing. Every Dominion soldier has been fitted with cybernetic implants that connect them to their command network. It's how they coordinate so effectively in battle. Sarah leaned forward, suddenly interested. Can these interfaces be disrupted? In theory, yes, but it would require a very specific type of electromagnetic pulse, tuned to the exact frequency of their neural implants. And even then, the effect would only be temporary. How temporary? Minutes at most. Maybe less, depending on their defensive protocols. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her mind working through possibilities that others couldn't see. Doctor, what would happen if we could disrupt their neural networks during a critical moment? Say, when they were executing a complex maneuver or coordinating a fleet action. Dr. Yates's expression grew thoughtful. It would be chaos. Imagine suddenly losing your ability to communicate with your subordinates in the middle of a battle. Ships would lose coordination, orders would be confused, formations would collapse. But, Admiral Kess interjected, we would need to be close enough to generate such a pulse, within weapons range of whatever the architect is bringing. Sarah smiled, and there was something in her expression that made the veteran officers nervous. "Admiral, I've been thinking about this all wrong. We've been playing defense, reacting to Dominion strategies instead of forcing them to react to ours. It's time to change that." The plan she outlined was the most audacious thing she had ever proposed. Instead of waiting for the Architect's weapon to reach Kepler, they would take the Alliance fleet to meet it in deep space. Not to fight in the conventional sense, but to attempt something that had never been tried before. A direct assault on the Dominion command structure itself. "You want to attack their flagship," General Fox said slowly. "I want to capture it," Sarah corrected. "The Architect has been studying us from a distance, analyzing our tactics and developing counters. But they've never faced a situation where their own command systems were compromised. The risk is enormous," Admiral Kess pointed out. "If we fail, we lose the entire fleet. If we don't try, we lose the war," Sarah replied. "The Architect is coming here to end the threat I represent. But they're making the same mistake every Dominion commander has made. They're thinking about this as a military problem when it's really a psychological one." The next 24 hours were spent in frantic preparation. Sarah worked with engineering teams to modify Alliance ships with electromagnetic pulse generators. She coordinated with intelligence operatives to gather every piece of information about Dominion command structures. Most importantly, she worked with the fleet's best pilots, teaching them maneuvers that would be necessary for the most dangerous part of her plan. When the Architect's massive vessel finally appeared on long-range sensors, the sight took everyone's breath away. It was less a ship than a mobile fortress, dwarfing even Dominion dreadnoughts. Its energy output suggested weapons capable of destroying planets. And its escort fleet was larger than anything the Alliance had ever assembled. "Sensor readings are off the charts," the science officer reported. "That thing could take on our entire fleet and win without support." "Yes," Sarah agreed, studying the tactical display. "If we fought it conventionally, but the Architect has made one critical error." "Which is?" Admiral Kess asked. Sarah pointed to the escort formation surrounding the massive vessel. "They're protecting it like it's just another ship. But something that large, that complex, requires constant communication with its support fleet. All those ships, all those neural networks, all linked together in perfect coordination." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "Which means," she continued, "that when we disrupt their neural networks, we won't just be affecting individual ships, we'll be cutting the head off the entire operation." As the Alliance fleet moved to intercept the Architect's forces, Sarah stood on the bridge of the Defiance, watching the massive enemy vessel grow larger on the viewscreen. Somewhere inside that fortress was the mind that had orchestrated the Dominion's conquest of half the galaxy. In a few hours, she would either end this war or die trying. And for the first time since she had put on an Alliance uniform, Sarah Chen was absolutely certain that the enemy had no idea what was about to hit them. The deep space between star systems had never seen a battle like this. Commander Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the Defiance, watching the Architect's massive fortress approach with its escort of 200 ships. The enemy formation stretched across space like a dark constellation, each vessel bristling with weapons that could glass a planet. "All Alliance ships report ready," Admiral Kess announced from her command station. "Electromagnetic pulse generators are charged and standing by." Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on the tactical display. The Alliance fleet looked pathetically small compared to what they faced. Barely 60 ships against an armada that represented the absolute pinnacle of Dominion military power. Any sane military commander would have ordered immediate retreat. Instead, Sarah was about to attempt something that military. Historians would later call either the greatest tactical victory or the most spectacular failure in galactic warfare. Signal from the Architects. "Ship," the communications officer reported. "They're demanding our immediate surrender." "Put it through," Sarah said. The voice that came through the speakers was unlike anything they had heard from Dominion forces before. Where other commanders spoke with mechanical precision, this voice carried an intelligence that was both ancient and utterly alien. "Commander Chen," the Architect said, somehow knowing exactly who they were addressing. "Your tactics have been interesting, but this ends now. You face the accumulated might of 1,000 conquered worlds. Surrender, and your death will be swift." Sarah activated her own communication system, broadcasting on all frequencies so that every ship in both fleets could hear her response. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had looked into the face of the impossible and found it wanting. "Architect," she said calmly, "you've studied my tactics, analyzed my strategies, and brought overwhelming force to bear against me. You've done everything a logical military mind would do." She paused, watching the enemy formation on her displays. "Unfortunately for you, humans aren't logical." The response was immediate and devastating. Energy beams lanced across space from the Architect's fortress, weapons powerful enough to destroy moon-striking Alliance ships with surgical precision. The escort fleet opened fire simultaneously, filling space with enough destructive energy to sterilize entire solar systems. But the Alliance fleet wasn't where the enemy expected it to be. Phase 1 complete, Sarah announced as Alliance ships emerged from positions that should have been impossible to reach undetected. Beginning close approach. The secret was something so simple that even Sarah was amazed the Dominion had never considered it. While their sensors were focused on detecting ships and weapons, they had completely ignored the small, cold objects that drifted through deep space in countless numbers. Asteroids, debris, the natural detritus that floated between stars. Alliance ships, powered down to minimal energy signatures and hidden within carefully hollowed-out asteroids, had been drifting toward the Architect's position for the last 6 hours. The enemy sensors, calibrated to detect active threats, had dismissed them as space junk. Now, as the Alliance fleet powered up and burst free from their concealment, they were already inside the Dominion defensive perimeter. The enemy formation, designed to engage threats at long range, suddenly found enemy ships appearing among them at point-blank range. "Neural network disruption in 30 seconds, Dr. Yates announced from the science station. "All ships maintain formation." Sarah watched the countdown timer, her heart racing. Everything depended on the next few moments. If the electromagnetic pulse failed to disrupt Dominion neural networks, the Alliance fleet would be destroyed before they could retreat. If it worked, they would have perhaps 5 minutes to accomplish the impossible. 10 seconds, Dr. Yates called out. The Dominion fleet was still reacting to the sudden appearance of enemy ships in their midst. Massive vessels tried to rotate to bring weapons to bear, but their formation had been designed for protection against external threats, not enemies that materialized inside their defensive lines. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Execute. The electromagnetic pulse erupted from every Alliance ship simultaneously. A coordinated burst of energy, tuned to the exact frequency of Dominion neural implants. The effect was invisible to normal sensors, but its impact was immediate and catastrophic. Across the enemy fleet, communication networks collapsed in an instant. Ship commanders who had been coordinating through direct neural links suddenly found themselves isolated, unable to contact their subordinates or receive orders from above. Complex maneuvers that required split-second timing became impossible. The perfect Dominion formation began to collapse into chaos. "Phase 2, Sarah called out. "All fighters execute boarding protocol." What followed was the most audacious assault in military history. Alliance fighters, small and fast, raced through the confused Dominion fleet toward their primary target, the Architect's massive fortress. The enemy's defensive systems, dependent on coordinated fire from multiple ships, couldn't function without their communication networks. Sarah led the assault personally, piloting a modified fighter that had been equipped with every piece of stealth technology the Alliance possessed. Behind her flew 20 of the best pilots in the fleet, each carrying specialized equipment for what they were about to attempt. The Architect's fortress was larger than some space stations, its hull bristling with weapons and defensive systems. Under normal circumstances, approaching it would have been suicide. But with its coordination systems offline, the massive vessel was like a giant with its eyes closed. "Boarding craft away," Sarah announced as her fighter approached the fortress's docking bay. "Remember, we have less than 4 minutes before their systems come back online." The boarding action was unlike anything in military history. Alliance Marines trained for ship-to-ship combat found themselves fighting through corridors designed for beings far larger than any known species. The Architect's ship was a maze of impossible geometry, its architecture following principles that seemed to ignore conventional physics. But Sarah had studied the captured Dominion vessels, learning the basic layout principles that all their ships followed. She led her team through corridors that twisted and turned in ways that hurt to look at, following a mental map that had been built from months of careful analysis. "Bridge should be ahead," she called out, as they fought through the final defensive position. Dominion soldiers cut off from their command network, fought with individual initiative rather than coordinated tactics. They were still dangerous, but they were no longer the unstoppable force that had conquered half the galaxy. The bridge, when they finally reached it, was nothing like what Sarah had expected. Instead of a traditional command center, they found themselves in a vast chamber filled with crystalline structures that pulsed with their own internal light. At the center of it all stood a figure that defied easy description. The architect was humanoid in the loosest sense, but their proportions were wrong, their movements too fluid for any known biology. When they turned to face the boarding party, Sarah found herself looking into eyes that held the cold intelligence of a machine and the ancient wisdom of something that had lived for millennia. "Commander Chen," the architect said, their voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from multiple sources. "You have exceeded all projections. I had not anticipated that organic intelligence could adapt at such a rate." "Surrender," Sarah said, raising her weapon. "Order your fleets to stand down." The architect tilted their head in what might have been amusement. "You misunderstand the nature of this conflict. The Dominion is not merely an empire. It is evolution itself, the natural progression toward perfect order. Your species represents chaos, unpredictability, the antithesis of everything we seek to achieve." "Maybe," Sarah agreed, "but chaos has one advantage over order." "Which is?" Sarah smiled, and in that moment, she looked exactly like what she was, a human who had been underestimated one too many times. Chaos is a lot harder to kill. The firefight that followed lasted less than a minute, but it would be remembered for centuries. When it ended, the architect lay motionless among their crystalline command systems, and Sarah stood over the being who had orchestrated the conquest of 1,000 worlds. "All Dominion forces," she broadcast on the fortress's communication system. "This is Commander Sarah Chen of the Alliance Fleet. Your leader is dead. Your command structure is compromised and your invasion is over. You have 1 minute to surrender before we demonstrate why humans are the most dangerous species in the galaxy." The response came not from one ship, but from hundreds. Across the Dominion fleet, vessel after vessel began broadcasting surrender codes, not because they had been defeated by superior firepower, but because something impossible had happened. A human, the species they had dismissed as weak and primitive, had boarded their most powerful vessel and killed the being they had believed to be invincible. As Alliance ships moved to secure the surrendered fleet, Sarah stood in the architect's command chamber, staring out at the stars. The war wasn't over. There were still Dominion forces throughout the galaxy, but something fundamental had changed. The rookie nobody took seriously had just killed the most powerful being in known space and captured their entire fleet. In the space of a few hours, Sarah Chen had become the most feared human in galactic history, and she was just getting started. 6 months after the death of the architect, Admiral Sarah Chen stood in the Grand Assembly Hall of New Geneva Station, watching representatives from across the galaxy gather for what historians would later call the most significant diplomatic event in galactic history. The hall had been built to accommodate thousands of beings from dozens of different species, but today it held something unprecedented. Former enemies coming to formally surrender to the Alliance. The transformation in Sarah herself was remarkable. Gone was the uncertain rookie who had once stood awkwardly in briefing rooms, while veteran officers questioned her judgment. In her place stood a figure who radiated quiet confidence, someone who had looked into the heart of galactic warfare and emerged victorious. Her new admiral's insignia caught the light as she moved, but it was her eyes that truly showed the change. They held the wisdom of someone who had seen the impossible become reality. "The hegemony delegation is requesting an audience," Admiral Kess announced, her forearms moving in gestures of deep respect. The Helix officer, once skeptical of human capabilities, now served as Sarah's second-in-command with something approaching reverence. Sarah nodded, watching the massive doors of the assembly hall open to admit the former Dominion forces. What entered was a procession that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. Corvani war chiefs who had never bowed to any authority. Helix battlemasters whose pride was legendary. Mentari psychic warriors who had considered themselves superior to all other forms of life. At the head of the procession walked General Vorth, the highest-ranking Dominion officer to survive the collapse of their command structure. The massive Corvani had once commanded fleets that destroyed star systems. Now he approached Sarah with movements that spoke of reluctant but absolute submission. Admiral Chen, General Vorth said, his voice carrying the gravelly tone that had once ordered the deaths of billions. I come to offer the formal surrender of all remaining hegemony forces in this sector. The hall fell silent as the significance of the moment sank in. This wasn't just a military surrender. It was the acknowledgement that the most powerful empire in galactic history had been brought to its knees by a species that had barely been spacefaring for a century. I accept your surrender, Sarah said simply, but I have conditions. General Vorth's expression showed surprise. In Dominion culture, surrender was absolute. The defeated had no right to negotiate terms. What conditions? Sarah gestured to the assembled representatives. Integration, not occupation. Your forces will be incorporated into the Alliance military structure. Your worlds will be given representation in the Galactic Council. Your people will be granted full citizenship rights. The silence that followed was deafening. Around the hall, beings who had fought each other for decades stared in amazement. Sarah was offering something that had never existed in galactic politics. Victory without vengeance. You would trust us? General Vorth asked, his voice heavy with disbelief. After everything we have done? Trust has to start somewhere, Sarah replied. The alternative is an endless cycle of warfare that benefits no one. Your empire fell because it was built on domination. The Alliance will succeed because it's built on cooperation. One by one, the former Dominion commanders knelt. It started with General Vorth, the massive Corvani lowering himself to one knee in a gesture that sent shockwaves through every being present. Others followed until hundreds of the galaxy's most feared warriors were kneeling before a human who had once been dismissed as an inexperienced rookie. But the most significant moment came when a figure emerged from the back of the Dominion delegation. Captain Thane, the commander who had led the first scout ships in the Kepler system, approached Sarah with something that could only be described as awe. Admiral, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I commanded the forces you defeated at Kepler 7. I have studied your tactics, analyzed your strategies, tried to understand how you accomplished the impossible. Sarah waited, recognizing that this moment was about more than military surrender. I still don't understand, Captain Thane continued. How did you know? How did you see opportunities where we saw only obstacles? How did you turn our strengths into weaknesses? Sarah looked out at the assembled representatives, seeing the same question in hundreds of eyes. They had all come seeking the same answer. How had one human changed the course of galactic history? You want to know the secret of human warfare? Sarah asked, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall. It's not about strength or technology or superior numbers. It's about seeing possibilities that others miss. She gestured to the holographic display that dominated the center of the hall, showing the current state of the galaxy. Alliance and former Dominion territories were color-coded, revealing the scope of what had been accomplished. Every species in this galaxy has natural advantages, Sarah continued. The Corvani are stronger, the Helix are faster, the Mentari have psychic abilities. But humans have something different. We have the ability to imagine things that don't exist yet. The hall was completely silent now, every being hanging on her words. When you looked at an asteroid field, you saw obstacles to navigation. We saw weapons waiting to be activated. When you looked at a gas giant's atmosphere, you saw environmental hazards. We saw a battlefield where your advantages would become liabilities. Captain Thane nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in his expression. But most importantly, Sarah said, when you looked at the Alliance, you saw a collection of weak species that could be conquered one by one. We saw the potential for something that had never existed before, a truly cooperative galactic civilization. The ceremony continued for hours, with formal surrenders from dozens of former Dominion commanders. Each one knelt before Sarah, acknowledging not just military defeat but recognition of a fundamental truth. The galaxy had changed, and humans had been the catalyst for that change. As the final delegation completed their surrender, Sarah found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than 2 years ago, she had been a rookie lieutenant that nobody took seriously. Now she was the most respected military commander in galactic history, but the title that meant the most to her came from an unexpected source. As the ceremony concluded, General Vorth approached her one final time. Admiral Chen, he said, there is something you should know. Among the former Dominion forces, you are known by a title that has never been given to any being before. What title is that? Sarah asked. The Architect of Peace, General Vorth replied. Because you did something that we thought was impossible. You won a war by making your enemies want to join you. Later that evening, Sarah stood alone on the observation deck of New Geneva Station, looking out at the stars. The galaxy was at peace for the first time in living memory, not because one empire had conquered all others, but because former enemies had chosen to work together. Ships from dozens of species moved through space around the station, their crews working side by side regardless of their origins. Corvani engineers collaborated with human scientists. Helix pilots trained alongside Mentari navigators. The alliance had become something greater than the sum of its parts. Admiral Kess joined her at the viewport, her forearms folded in a gesture of contentment. The integration process is proceeding ahead of schedule, the Helix officer reported. Former Dominion commanders are adapting to Alliance protocols with minimal resistance. Good, Sarah said. How are our exploration missions progressing? 3 new star systems have been surveyed this week. 2 show signs of habitable worlds and 1 contains mineral resources that could support significant colonization efforts. Sarah nodded, but her attention was focused on something else. The galaxy was vast, containing countless unexplored regions and unknown civilizations. The Alliance had brought peace to this sector, but there were other threats out there, other empires that might challenge the cooperative civilization they were building. Kess, she said quietly, what do you think we'll find out there? In the unexplored regions? The Helix Admiral considered the question carefully. Unknown civilizations, certainly. Some will be peaceful, others hostile. There will be challenges we can't imagine yet, Sarah smiled. And there was something in her expression that reminded Admiral Kess why this human had become the most feared military commander in known space. Good, Sarah said. I was starting to get bored. As the 2 officers stood watching the stars, reports were already coming in from the frontier regions. Long-range sensors had detected artificial signals from the galactic rim, suggesting the presence of civilizations that had never made contact with known space. Some of the signals showed concerning patterns, possibly indicating military activity. But Sarah Chen, the rookie nobody had taken seriously, was no longer worried about facing the unknown. She had learned something that would serve her well in whatever challenges lay ahead. The universe was full of beings who thought they understood warfare, right up until they encountered a human who had learned to think differently. The galaxy had changed, and it would never be the same again. The legend of the Admiral who,